Hello and welcome back to the rise and fall of the Chill Out Room, a history of ambient house and ambient techno 1989 to 1996. And so to 1996. If 1995 was the year that the ambient boom began to fall apart and fracture, then 1996 was the year it died. No longer receiving critical acclaim, instead the word ambient was more likely to be found on one of dozens of compilations of long-release tracks, mellow jazzy trip-hop, classical music, jazz or new age than in the text of an end-of-year list. Many of the movement's big names moved on in style, labels began to fold. Let's look at some of the big names to start the year. The Future Sound London's Dead Cities begins with 2 minutes of big beat, chopped and mangled Run DMC drums, vocals and guitar power chords. Lead single, My Kingdom, is probably the closest thing on the album to the group's most famous sound, but even then, despite some lovely pads and sampled vocals, it's all trip-hop drum loops, acoustic guitars and film soundtrack flutes. It's actually slightly odd in hindsight that We Have Explosive wasn't the lead single. Released in summer '96 under the alias Semtex as a promo 12-inch, it's become the band's most famous track behind Papua New Guinea, in part down to its use on the same Wipeout game soundtrack as tracks by Orbital, the Chemical Brothers, Underworld and Photech. With its aggressively buzzing synths, borderline novelty electronic voices and thudding drums, it arrived at the peak of big beat, and had it been the lead single, might well have been a massive hit. It still became the group's highest charting single, reaching number 12 in early '97, backed with funky breakbeat remixes from Oil and Curtis Mantronic, as well as their own multi-part EP, reworking it into electro-funk and isolationist bleakness. Dead Cities isn't all big beat. Indeed, it continues the pair's development of each album being more varied than the previous, but there's very little chill-out room material here. The title track is one of several forays into atmospheric IDM, a grim track that blends apocalyptic darkness with harrowing melancholia. Gary Cobain's singing and whispering words over the outro, asking someone to make him believe he's not going to die. 3 tracks later he wails, "Everyone in the world is doing something without me." This is not a positive album. Further IDM tracks include the paranoid Aphex Twin-esque Antique Toy, while scrapped third single Glass's achingly sad melodies are full of painful longing. Quagmire is the group's own bizarre take on Jungle, a sound that would also feature on many of the album's outtakes that were played during the ISDN tour that followed. The closest the album comes to strict ambient is in the form of a number of modern classical collaborations. Singer Rebecca Kane on the devastating Everyone in the World is Doing Something Without Me, a purely choral track, while future post-minimalist superstar Max Richter co-writes the stunning piano, string and sax composition simply named Max. Through Your Gills I Breathe features no-name contributors, but similarly is a beautiful interlude for piano and acoustic guitar improv. And then the album ends on some medieval ambient industrial, it'd probably pass for dungeon synth these days, with First Death in the Family, before a secret track in the form of Punk City, a slice of lo-fi punk from former snuff guitarist Simon Wells, overlaid with FSOL electronics and field recordings. Is Dead Cities an ambient album? In many ways, yes. It paints an incredibly visceral picture of a city on the perpetual verge of collapse. But it's almost entirely unrelated musically to the sound of albums like Lifeforms and Tales of Ephedrina. Alternately aggressive and heartbreaking, Dead Cities strikes out into the sound of '96. Despite this, it didn't sell as well as hoped, peaking at 26 in the album chart and spending only 3 weeks in the top 100. By the time the We Have Explosive single was released in March '97, the group's ISDN shows had already developed into playing a range of entirely new material, mostly big beats sampling guitars, organs, vocals and orchestras from 60s and 70s psych records. A Kiss FM DJ mix of this exact type of material, called a monstrous psychedelic bubble exploding in your mind, set out the template for what would be their next album, a psych big beat record with vocals and guitars that would probably have been promoted alongside the stylistically similar Surrender by the Chemical Brothers. It wasn't to be, the album morphed into the first record by the group's new psych rock version of Amorphous Androgynous, and it was well over 4 years before anybody heard anything from the band, by which point the entire music industry had changed dramatically. The final 2 releases to come out under the name Global Communication were strikingly different from anything the group had put out to date. Clearly satisfied with their IDM and ambient works, Middleton and Pritchard decided to expand and work in new areas. After a one-off Jungle EP in '95 under the name The Chameleon, they returned to Global Communication for the double A-side The Way, The Deep. 2 12-minute deep house tracks, there's not much trace of the group's former sound here. Sampled, soulful vocals, jazzy chords and 4-to-the-floor beats are The Way's ingredients, and it's an excellent track, although thoroughly unambient. The pads and deep bass of The Deep come straight out of the group's earlier sound, but are once again reframed in the deep house style. Interestingly, it became the group's highest charting recording, reaching number 51 in the UK singles chart at the very start of '97. They would only release one further track as global communication, The Groove, which, as its name suggests, was not a return to ambient. Indeed, the '97 single takes the deep house sound much further into jazz territory, full of electric piano and trumpet solos and live funky electric bass. They released other music in '96, including 2 garage-tinged house 12 inches as secret ingredients, and released their final album, New School Science, under the name Jedi Knights. Although featuring some atmospheric IDM-esque moments, the Truth, Human Blancmange and Afterlife could just about pass off as new Reload material, the bulk of the album is funky electro and breaks. As Jedi Knights, they would go on to do a fair amount of remix work and put out a handful of singles, including the Big Ones EP, which cracked the UK top 100 on 12-inch sales alone, but this was pretty much the end of the road for Middleton and Pritchard together. They briefly reunited a few times in the 21st century, spawning a couple of mixed CDs for the Fabric and Back in the Box series. The Fabric CD was broadly breaks and hip-hop, while 2011's Back in the Box set was more nostalgic, mixing together classics like System 7 Fuse, Speedy J, Robert Liner and Aphex Twin. A 2015 reunion spawned a pair of global communication remixes of Dusky Skin Deep in the group's classic 94 style, albeit created solely by Tom Middleton. It's likely to be a one-off, however, so should be treasured. It's bloody beautiful. Middleton and Pritchard both have exceptionally active solo projects using various names and in countless styles, and continue to release music to this day. Spacetime Continuum's Emit Ecaps shows off another artist whose finger was on the pulse, and this record found Jonas Sharp incorporating all the aesthetic elements of Seabiscuit but framing them in a very different light. iForm and Pod highlight the electro elements of his typical crisp hi-hat heavy percussion. Cairo takes advantage of the development of drum and bass from Jungle, the jazzier, more overtly programmed style beginning to become a separate entity at this point. The arpeggios and pluck melodies are pure Seabiscuit, but then we're into high-speed breaks and a jazzy double bass section. Funky R is funky house, Swing Fantasy blends deep house with IDM, and Vertigo owes a lot to the Black Dog's own mutilated version of Detroit techno. The decision to present the album as 10 distinct tracks, as opposed to a single gapless soundscape, also speaks of a less ambient perspective, with only a few very subtle crossfades featuring. There's still ambience here. Sim City is 3 minutes of pure atmosphere, Out Here is fax-friendly ambient trance, and were it not better than quite a bit of that album, one might believe that the stunning album closer was a Seabiscuit outtake. But as an album, Emit Ecaps has one eye on the dance floor, the other on new trends in home listening music. Following their 2-part Point 3 and its completely ambient Water album, System 7 returned with Power of 7, another departure of sorts. The noise sampling opener begins very much in krautrock territory before developing into drum and bass, clearly the sound of the year. Civilization is aquatic IDM in collaboration with Carl Craig. The amusing spoken snippet at the start of Davy Jones's Locker marks it out as an Alex Patterson collab, and with its gentle dub vibe makes it the closest the album gets to ambient. With fewer collaborators in general, the Power of 7 finds Hillage and Girardi becoming more confident in their own skills, and when left to their own devices they seem to be heading into a mix of drum and bass and trance, Nektube even edging into psytrance territory. Alex Patterson delivered the third Orb album in 1996. Ireland were very pleased with it, and then they told him they wouldn't release it until the following year, or so the story goes. Having released 5 albums in 5 years, 6 if you include the remix album, the Orb were due a year off anyway. Still, there was a gap in the market and they filled it in collaboration with Deviant Records. Their remix album, Auntie Aubrey's Excursions Beyond the Call of Duty, wasn't released on Ireland. Clearly Alex was sick of them as well. That's 3 labels in a row who'd screwed him around. Deviant couldn't do that too, could they? Actually, the UK edition came out almost entirely in mono. Patterson really couldn't get a break. The Orb had become renowned remixers, creating huge long dub soundscapes in their usual style, throwing in elements of the provided work in the way they would their usual samples. With remixing spanning a period of from 90 to 95, this is a pretty broad set, but it runs together nicely. They often made their mixes into tiny little Orb records in their own right, not just going with the main track, but long collages at the beginning and end for that patented Orb ambience. And so when pieced together, we actually end with a dense sound collage of an album a bit more in FSOL style than your usual Orb record. Material's praying mantra is 12 minutes of brilliant atmospheric ethno-ambient dub, followed by 4 of bizarre noises, warping electronics and synthetic burbles. These bits could easily have been chopped off for ease, but nope, they're here in full, with the tracks cross-fading. I fully approve. I like my Orb long, atmospheric and collagey, and this is a kind of a bonus album in that style. With the next album starting a run of records based around shorter tracks, it's really nice to get something as absorbing as this one last time. The Trans-Asian Express mix of Keiichi Suzuki's Satellite Serenade is a real highlight here, one of the very finest tracks of all the ambient house era. On the whole though, I think this first set of Excursions Beyond the Call of Duty might be my second favourite record from Auntie Aubrey, after Orbis Terrarum. Might seem strangely out of place in '96, but who cares, bravo! Patterson also used the year as an opportunity to pop out a second disc of Peel session tracks with sessions from '92 and '95 represented. OOBE has given a more melodic overhaul in possibly its best version, including guitar from the same Steve Wright piece sampled in Little Fluffy Clouds, an arrangement of Montan d'Or that launches into space rock, and a dubbier and less textual version of Valley. Oh, and a cover of the Stooges' No Fun, a full band arrangement, Alex doing his best John Lydon impression. Once a punk, always a punk. Beyond was one of the labels for which '96 was its last operational year. It released 3 varied albums over the course of '96, starting with Insanity Sect's Manisola. A pair of brothers, Insanity Sect apparently started back in '78, but most likely remained more of a hobby until the pair began working with electronica in the early '90s. Their sole album is pretty solid, typical Beyond material, dubby bass lines, acid squelches, light rolling beats, gentle techno melodies. The best way I can think of describing it is Higher Intelligence Agency's musical younger brother. Banya Luka is bright and melodic, a glorious track, while USA Part 3 is more sinister and deeply ambient. Hunza Water is a wonderful sound collage of vocal samples, lakeside field recordings, gentle synths and bubbling beats. Positive Plus is the perfect name for a euphoric album closer. On the whole, it's a quiet, unassuming album, not one that's going to be rocketing to the top of anyone's favourites list, but it does what it does incredibly well. In the very last days of this style, it's nice to hear it still being done so competently. By 1996, 2 was down to the duo of Martin Franklin and Nick Parkin. When they got together with Eddie Sayer, a percussionist occasionally active in the ambient acoustic and tribal ambient worlds, instead of inviting him into the fold, they instead formed a one-off project called Stillpoint. Their lone album, Maps Without Edge, was maybe the final time a tribal ambient album was presented outside the scene's core outlets. It sounds like a 2 album, brooding synths, bells, flutes, those African drums I've never been able to accurately identify, and it's maybe the darkest they created, feeling much closer to the kind of thing one would expect from artists like Vidna Abmana than the slightly lighter leaning sounds of albums like All Our Ancestors. The 3-part Blade Water Stone composition that recurs as tracks 1, 3 and 5 is especially atmospheric and creepy. Not an easy-going, relaxing album, but a deep, dark atmosphere to be sucked into. The last ever release on Beyond was one of its most famous. In 1995, Bobby Bird travelled to Tromsø in Norway to take part in the Polar Music Festival alongside Geir Jensen. The pair were commissioned to make recordings of the area and use them as the basis of a new work. One of these performances was recorded at the top of a mountain only accessible by cable car and was released as HIA and Biosphere's Polar Sequences. This is a dark album. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given that by the time it was performed, Tromsø was in a period of almost permanent darkness. Still, despite having created Arctic ambient in the past, removed from its spacey context, Biosphere's music is pitch black here. As for HIA, well, I barely hear him, to be honest. I'm not suggesting he isn't present, I'm sure this is a 50-50 collaboration, but other than perhaps the beats, which do feel a little more like Colourform than anything of Biosphere's, Bird's bright, bouncy electronic dub is nowhere to be found. Beneath the spoken word, chilly minor key melodies and crisp drum beats are the local samples, often murky, crumbling, crunching, creaking, like the sound of a glacier moving imperceptibly beneath your feet. The final track, Meltwater, is pure field recordings. Not one for the faint of heart, Polar Sequences is a bleak and heavy-going record, and one that I think of as unique, but interestingly a decade later, Nurse with Wound were commissioned to create a very similar project, released as Shipwreck Radio. An acclaimed and popular release, Polar Sequences was reissued in 2003 on Bird's headphone label, and again as CD and double vinyl on Jensen's Biophon in 2019. And with that, Beyond disappeared as quietly as it arrived, leaving behind a catalogue of a few classics and a few forgotten records. Perhaps its most lasting legacy is with its American cousin Waveform, who would continue for another 25 years. Back to the subject of Higher Intelligence Agency collaborations. In 1996, Deep Space Network finally reappeared after a couple of years of silence and released 2 albums. One was Deep Space Network meets Higher Intelligence Agency. Unlike Polar Sequences, here the 2 artists' sounds are blended entirely, making it difficult to know where one ends and the other begins. There are also new avenues explored. The deep techno with sweeping melodies of Pack is surprisingly reminiscent of Matt Jarvis's Gas album, while some of the record's melodies recall the bleep techno of 90 and 91. On the whole, the sound is crisp, dry, rarely utilising many of Ambient's tools such as dub bass, reverb or samples. We also get some stripped back house on Ramp 1 and wonky, slightly funky IDM on Baconor. T-Map takes cues from Isolationist Drone and ends things on a very curious note. The beatless Chai is the only real concession to the two projects' recent pasts, perhaps hinting at directions both Higher Intelligence Agency and Deep Space Network might have taken had they recorded albums in the late 90s. It's a diverting listen, but one that once again moves away from ambient house. Similarly, the stark minimal art is a world away from the trippier images the acts were known for. Deep Space Network also released a live album in '96. Not a format the era was especially known for other than the Orb and Namlook. Nevertheless, it's an interesting record for it kind of being a new DSN album, on the grounds that none of these tracks exist in studio form. And with no crowd noise, you could be forgiven for thinking it's a studio album. There are field recordings running through much of the set, mostly of urban environments, traffic, car horns, distant chatter, crowd noise, that definitely gives the record more of a human feel than the spacier big rooms. And again, this is reflected in the music's sound, with a frequently jazzy house element coming to the fore on many tracks. This is still chilled, laid-back music, but it leans more heavily into this playful, groovy side of the band's sound. Even a track like Deep Space features funky bass lines and jazzy chords, although some airy pads do add atmosphere. Nevertheless, I'm very much not reminded of Deep Space. On the whole, the album is closer to the sound of a European city on a summer evening, warm, cultured, laid-back, even very, very slightly sexy. With Traffic, the Deep Space Network finally came down to earth. Talking of live albums, Banco de Gaia's Live at Glastonbury features possibly the most ambient house cover released this side of 1992. There's crowd noise here, so I can confirm that these 10 or so cows weren't the actual audience. The record even begins with some wonderfully daft sampling that could have come from an earlier Orb record. Also pretty sure this section uses a choir sample also used in Woob's O'Donnell. On the subject of Banco de Gaia, Enigma released their first album in 3 years in 1996. It stank. It still stinks. By this point, a solo Michael Cretu project in all but name, Enigma's third album, Le Roi est Mort, Vive le Roi, is an attempt to blend the sounds of the first two albums, but what this really means is Gregorian chants and world music samples sit uncomfortably alongside each other. What makes those first two stand out somewhat from the other ethno-fusion new agey records is that they're actually put together to make distinct soundscapes. The Roi est Mort is just dull trip-hop, absolutely caked in samples from everything and anything, leading to a thick soup of bland noise that doesn't work in the slightest. And Cretu has decided that he wants to be a songwriter too, so he sings on almost every song here. His lyrics are trite, half-arsed pseudo-spiritual nonsense riddled with cliches. I mean, at least last time he wrote a song condemning colonialism. There are a few pretty synth parts, and Shadows and Silence is actually a really nice ambient piece, but yeah, this is pretty shit otherwise. Even as a teenager who adored the first two, I thought this was irredeemably bad. It was the first genuinely disappointing album I ever bought. Sadly, it wasn't the last. Although it was the last Enigma album I bought. Another label that said goodbye in 1996 was Recycle or Die. With only a tiny catalogue to its name, the German imprint made a tiny mark on the ambient scene of the time, although a couple of standard Berlin School albums aside, it had one of the most idiosyncratic and creative outputs of any of them, even if some of the experiments didn't quite work. A collaboration between Gottfried Tollmann of Baked Beans and Ralph Hildenbeutel, Tollmannhildenbeutel, I wonder how long it took them to come up with that, features the kind of rhythm-forward, trance-inducing repetition one might expect from just that lineup. However, instead of the usual tribal drums, several tracks here feature much more unusual sounds. I've no idea what the main loop in Frogs at Dries consists of, probably frog samples, but it's extremely strange, and it's accompanied by almost childlike fluty improvisation. The linked titles of Isn't That a Funny Bird and It's a Hornbill add some playfulness to the tracklist, although the two seem musically unconnected. One of my very best friends, meanwhile, consists of detuned guitar and discordant synths, suggesting that this very good friend is in fact a serial killer. Much like Hildenbeutel's solo album on Recycle or Die, Tollmannhildenbeutel reaches for the same kind of addictively hypnotic grooves as Baked Beans, but just misses the mark, making these pieces feel slightly inconsequential, and as with many artists of the time, the pair have adopted trip-hop style drums, removing some atmosphere in the process. It's a very strange, genuinely experimental album that frequently sounds like nothing else, although the actual results are of questionable quality. Recycle or Die's final album, Mia's Welcome Spacebrothers, throws a curveball which, with this label, should actually have been expected. Acidic, mellow, progressive house? Why not? A selection of remixes was put out in '97 as a compilation called Backlash, broadly drum bass and breaks with a few house tracks, although in a very rare crossover, Taylor Dupree does remix a track from Tollmannhildenbeutel into a quite sinister piece of drone. This wasn't intended as the way the label would end. Limited Noises About 8 Minutes was signed up as the 12th release, but the label closed before it could be manufactured. With future jazz influences, it suggests Recycle or Die may have followed the stylistic direction of many other labels. A label that should have said goodbye in '96 was Silent. In fact, it nearly did, but, well, I'll get to that. The year began with the final album by Heavenly Music Corporation. Anechoic's liner notes cite influence largely from older music such as the experimental compositions of Mort and Subotnick, and the sticker states the album boldly explores new territory. At this point, Cascone had already begun to tire of the ambient scene of the time, seeking new challenges, and that can be heard in the music of Anechoic. Although still definitely a product of Heavenly Music Corporation, this is the same dreamy synth work for the most part. It's considerably more sparse than the earlier three. Pretty much like a single hour-long composition, it's built around a long droning synth chord over which sweeps, gurgles, arpeggios and other synthetic sounds come and go. Although retaining the silent warmth, it feels closer to one of Namlook's darker, spacier hour-long improvisations, and after 25 minutes things do get a bit darker. In the title track, the background synths begin to become discordant, the previously pleasant arpeggios and squelches turn harsher. Electron Blue brings in a crispy distortion and 70s Doctor Who soundtrack sounds with rambling atonal analogue sequences. A murky 303 line rumbles underneath before fading out and allowing things to warm up again for the final two tracks. Anechoic is not the kind of meditative bliss that was found on the first three Heavenly Music Corporation albums, with even its gentler sections being busy and texturally quite harsh. Having explored the sounds of ambient techno for a few years, Cascone was interested in experimenting once more, and in some ways the album returns to his roots. Indeed, those roots became even more obvious in the next album on the label, an unreleased PGR record from 1990, suddenly brought back to life and put out, initially on Japan's Noctovision label, but then on Silent. Four lengthy atonal, occasionally quite harsh electroacoustic drone pieces, a whole of unknown depth reappearing now, signals Cascone's increased interest in the more confrontational sounds of his early releases. Further minimal drone albums then came from Chris Maloch, who'd also released similar music on Fax the previous year, and Waveform Transmission. There was one more conventional album released in '96, if the ethnic ambient dub of Makyo's Rasa Bhava really counts as conventional silent. Certainly in line with some other mid-90s records though. The project of Giovanni Fazio, Makyo will go on to release many more albums for Dakini, and the sound is perhaps unsurprising. Eastern and Middle Eastern vocals and instruments blended with dub bass, breakbeats, atmospheric elements and so on. It does the job pretty well, although I think Dakini's suggestion that 25 years on it still sounds unique is a little optimistic, since there have been hundreds of albums following this template since. There was also the final volume of From Here to Tranquility, the last of the classic label-based ambient compilations, and the only one released in '96. For once only featuring Silent Records artists, and including many pre-93 artists like Pelican Daughters, Thessalonians, Faust, Burning Sea and PGR, it's mostly drone, with some tribal bits in the middle and, completely out of place, some ambient trance from Transcendental Anarchists at the end. And then Kim Cascone decided it was time to move on. He'd found new work as a sound designer for the interactive computer audio company Headspace, and clearly no longer pursuing the kind of music Silent had become famous for, he decided to close the label down. 11 years and some real influence on American ambient music isn't a bad legacy for a label. While working at Headspace, he discovered the programming language C-Sound, and discovered a whole new musical language. He used the software to create Blue Cube, released on the fledgling Rasta Noton in 1998. One might conceivably imagine from the opening track title that this could be an ambient album, but then the whole thing is sucked into a void of abstract noise and chaos, harsh and digital sound art. One piece is called St. Giga, the same as a Heavenly Music Corporation track, a remix or remake perhaps, but it sounds nothing like the original if so. Cascone went on to work with many of the labels in the world of digital experimentation and microsound, such as Mille Plateau, Monotype, and collaborating with Taylor Dupree on his 12K label. And that was it for Silent. Except it wasn't. One of the employees at the label, who seems to have remained unnamed, offered to buy Silent from Cascone. Not a bad idea necessarily, someone with a love for the label and its music continuing the legacy. Only it seemed to be more of a case of riding off a successful name. The first release on Silent Mark II was Land of Baboon, a compilation of dub, hip-hop and ambient. There's some good music on it, and it was popular enough to spawn 2 sequels, albeit neither on Silent. But it's not entirely what someone might expect from the label. Maybe following the Makyo album there's some coherency. Then 1997 brought an introduction to British IDM label Scam called Scampler, Good material, but no sign of Silent's own identity. This became part of the new Silent approach, however, with a series of 12 inches released in collaboration with other labels. From tech house to hip-hop, drum bass to progressive trance, the style of each release was dependent entirely on the label being worked with. And while most of the material was very good, it ultimately just felt like a cynical cash grab operation rather than an actual artistic project. Perhaps unsurprisingly, it didn't last, and after a year or so, Silent folded in a much worse state than Cascone had left it. Ironically, a compilation of material from this era with the optimistic title of So Far ended up being largely destroyed, with no funds to actually release it or create the artwork. For a happier ending, Cascone relaunched Silent as a digital label in 2016, focusing once again on drone ambient. On the east coast of America, Instinct Ambient carried on, although with only 5 releases. Unsurprisingly abandoning the monthly format of 95 and also unsurprisingly largely avoiding ambient itself, the label followed the Virgin Ambient series mould of just using the ambient name to release anything electronic that wasn't dance music. This included the mix of ambient and reggae on Sub Sub's self-titled album, interestingly enough ending up as the final release on Instinct Ambient Europe, and a surprising mix of trip-hop and funky mellow techno from Dupree and Isatis under the name Foutique. For all its unexpected stylic diversion, Luv Luv does feature the kind of cold atmospheric minimalism one would expect from the two producers behind SETI, albeit just filtered through a very different array of sounds. At times sounding like a stripped back version of FSOL's ISDN, it's a very rare trip-hop leaning album that I would actually recommend to ambient house fans, purely through its excellent use of atmosphere. In more actual ambient territory, Tetsuya Inoe's first non-fax album, World Receiver, came out on Instinct Ambient. The album opens with field recordings of a city, but instead of crossfading into Inoe's familiar rich ambient blankets, instead things become more minimal. This is Inoe's new sound. There are hints of it on his earlier fax releases with their crackly digital textures, but here the filtered and treated field recordings land centre stage, over which light, airy digital pads twist and turn. Inoe's melodic sense is still present, and although quiet, the synths here are beautiful. It's a quiet and minimal album, one making a definitive statement as a move away from the analogue space music of old, although it has its playful side, as on the organ and laughter in Background Story. The album was reissued by the drone and experimental label Infraction in 2006, and later issued as a download by fax. On the slightly more traditional end of things, Adam Shake contributed his second album to Instinct Ambient in collaboration with Tim Floyd. Floyd is the guitarist here, and there's electric guitar improv over the whole thing. Do you like electric guitar improv? If not, this is not the album for you. I don't mind it, it really has its place, and at times here it's really lovely, throwing in some lonely notes that help paint a picture of a vast, empty landscape with no signs of life. Shake's other sounds are present, droning synths, gentle tribal percussion, sitar, but this time the source of raw material came from travels around the Pacific Northwest of America, as opposed to a journey across India, leading to a much cooler, less exotic sounding album. These frequently unidentified field recordings inspire the mood of the music itself, which is much less spiritually uplifting than Journey to the Sun, with minor keys generally the go-to here. The blend of a drum machine and electric guitar in Snake Dance is a step too far for me, ending up sounding like a stoner jamming third-rate blues at home with a rhythm box. The combination of guitar and electronics is one of the hardest to get right, but on the whole the playing is restrained enough to just about get away with it. Embers has a nocturnal folky feel, which makes it a highlight. Drift is a step below Shake's debut, but still has lots to offer. After this point he would largely release through his own Sonic Turtle label. Ambient Systems 2, the second in what would end up being an odd and sporadic series, is strange. It starts by going, hey, digital minimalism, with tracks by Dietrich Sherman, Steps Discharge, Omicron, SETI, Tetsuya Inoue, John Selway and Terra Thameless, which are all clicking repetitive beats, barely there wisps of melody and field recording based drones, and then suddenly it's all dub, electro, tribal downtempo and rich analogue synths. Needless to say, one disc looks forward and the other looks very much backwards. Despite producing fewer covers for Instinct, Dupree was clearly still on good enough terms with the label, and he and his artist released the final SETI album in October '96. The booklet features a fictional story of computer systems communicating about philosophy, but the music is as bleak as ever. This time labelled as Fragments, the 9 pieces again explored drone and minimal rhythms. Melody is far more sparse this time, repetition more overt, and tracks like Fragment 3 bear clear influence from the increasingly popular world of minimal techno. Indeed, the rhythms aren't as loose and off-kilter as the earlier IDM-aligned records, with simple, occasionally syncopated beats repeating for long spells. At the same time, Dupree released his first solo release, under his own name at least, for Abe Duke's Rancho Relaxo imprint. Anyone hoping for more human mesh dance will be bitterly disappointed. This is all extremely minimal noisy techno and electro. Despite the Instinct Ambient Europe deal resulting in an aborted range, KK Records did launch a sister label which picked up a number of Instinct artists, including yet another alias for its artist and Dupree with Arc, and their minimal IDM album 12K, a tremendous record if way out of the scope of this series. It's artist's third Omicron album, Globetrotter, which finds him working with various styles of techno, although Mist will appeal to fans of his earlier albums, as well as a compilation called Exit to New York, consisting almost entirely of Instinct ambient artists, but restricted to minimal techno. The label, by the way, was called Radical Ambient, which is definitely a statement, although what it means I'm yet to work out. Oh, and a number of artists from the Rancho Relaxo label came together as Rancho Relaxo All-Stars and put out an album on a totally unrelated label. It's ambient but of the cold minimal variety with some bizarre sounds. Needless to say, nobody should be expecting any ambient house out of New York from this point on. Apollo had a very good 95. Despite a lower release rate, the records it put out were all excellent. In contrast, 96 saw the release of only one album on the label, and that was right at the end of November. There were the usual EPs, although only 4 in this case, David Morley shifting into IDM on Stardancer, a one-off Locust single, a light jazzy vocal drum and bass track that bears absolutely nothing in common with his bleakly atmospheric earlier work, a collection of dark trip-hop and drum and bass from Neotropic alias Small Fish with Spine, and some breakbeat jazz from Butter Foundation, released the previous year in America. Of those 4, only a couple of tracks on the Morley release feel remotely in line with previous Apollo material. There was also a Biosphere Best Of distributed to Japan, although how they've managed to do a best of 2 albums and still miss out his sole hit, Novelty Waves, is beyond me. The sole album of the year was Sun Electric's Present, their second studio album, although effectively their 5th full length. Developing their sound further, here they bring in elements of breaks, IDM, glitch and deep house to their techno, and as with so much electronic music of the time, the emphasis seems to be moving away from atmospheres and towards more intimate and frequently jazzy sounds. The record is bookended with the conventional beatless intro and outro, while Crystal Ballore is reminiscent of their earlier ambient-leaning works, but this is really Sun Electric leaving ambient behind and taking on the avant techno forms growing increasingly popular. In Japan, Toshinori Kondo and DJ Crush released Ki-Oku. The hip-hop producer and jazz trumpeter collaborated to make an album that sounds exactly like you'd expect from that description, jazzy instrumental hip-hop. It was licensed to Apollo just over a year later at the start of '98. Up in Scandinavia, April continued on, slightly diversifying its sound with the trance of Mnemonic's album Weapons, and electro on number 1 by Acoustic. In more ambient territory, Double Muffled Dolphin's second album, The Lions Are Growing, operates in similar territory to his debut, albeit with slightly less success. Not that this album's anyway a bad record, and Crystal Fall is beautiful, but it leaves less of an impression than My Left Side Is Out of Sync, offering more traditional and obvious synth music. Meanwhile, Swimwear catalogue returned with a genuinely odd, if wholly unambient album of Berlin School and DIY IDM. Norway's leading ambient label, Origo, released precisely nothing in '96. However, a more contemporary electronica label from the same country did put out its first proper album that year, Mind Over MIDI's Electrical Activity. Beat Service Records had begun in '94, but other than a compilation called Tromso Techno, had only released a run of techno 12 inches. The Mark Biosphere's 2 albums made on Norwegian electronic artists really was remarkable, and the first half of Electrical Activity bears Jensen's mark, melodic ambient techno with the same slightly lo-fi textures, darkness and sadness. The project of Helga Tomavag, Mind Over MIDI would go on to become one of the country's most prolific ambient techno artists, and this debut is really just formative, a hint of what would come, although one featuring some occasionally brilliant sound design such as the bizarre underwater sounding drums of Electrical Utility. One of the other big Norwegian acts, Adina Cycle, had split, but Sveinberg and Torbjorn Brundtland went on to form Elena, whose sound was atmospheric folk, tribal ambient, dub, trip-hop and arctic ambient blended in a way that sometimes felt smooth and natural, sometimes quite awkward. Their album Instinctive Travels is flawed but thoroughly unique and certainly worth a listen. The next stop for this ever-changing collective was Drum Island. And on that note, I'll leave you for today. I'll be back very soon looking at labels like Emit and Fax. Please do leave me a comment about today's video if you liked it, and if you like the music, or even if you hate the music. I love reading your comments. There are also like, subscribe, share buttons down there you might also want to press. And for those of you who use Spotify, check down below in the video description. There should be a link to a Spotify playlist that accompanies this series of videos, I'll be updating that with all the material I cover every time a video comes out. And I hope to see you soon.